in kindergarten. I brought home a report card one day at the end of this is in August, this is in March 1947, the year of our independence. I was 5 years old, and my mother saw me with this report card entering the house, and she says, "Did you stand first?" My father was behind her on the other side, and he said to my mother, that was the wrong question. Ask him what he likes about school. Does he like to draw? Does he like poetry? Does he like stories? Does he like to sing? Who are his friends? Those are the right questions.
Welcome to Inspire Someone Today podcast, a show where we dive into the stories and insights that has the power to create ripples of inspiration in your life. I'm your host Shrikant, and I'm thrilled to be with you on this journey of inspiration. Hey, my dear listeners, we are back with yet another episode with yet another guest. Joining us today is Gurcharan Das. Mr. Gurcharan Das needs no introductions. He is an Indian author, commentator, and former CEO of Procter and Gamble, India. He is widely known for his books that explore India's economy, culture, and moral philosophy, such as India Unbound and the difficulty of being good. Doing the rounds on the stands is his latest memoir, which is another sort of freedom. That's the reason why we are here today for. Without much further ado, Gulcharan ji, thank you for joining us on this episode of Inspire Someone Today.
Thank you.
Let's get started. From the Nahi Kumar to Gulcharan Das, how did this transition happen?
Well, I must have been 3. I just learned to run. And by the way, I've been running ever since. And often I run into myself. But the reason I remember so much of my childhood is because my mother kept a diary. And I appeared on page 17 of her diary for the first time. And she says, "This is a restless baby." And then 6 months later, she's calling me a difficult child. And then a year later, she's calling me a troublemaker. And when I went to the kindergarten, my teacher, I kept raising my hands to do something that was not allowed. And the teacher kept saying, "Nahi, Nahi." And so she said, "Look, from tomorrow, I'm going to call you Nahi, and Nahi Kumar, because that will be much easier." And anyway, so that is how my name evolved until my grandmother suspected that my mother gave me the name Ashok Kumar because she thought my mother was secretly in love with a Bollywood actor named Ashok Kumar. You know, the Bollywood actor there, Ashok Kumar, was just as popular today as Amitabh Bachchan or Shah Rukh Khan or whatever. Anyway, my grandmother then took me to a guru and she placed me at his feet and she asked the guru, "Give this boy a name." And since he saw me at his feet, he said, "Let's call him Gurcharan Das." So I was instantly transformed at age 4 from Ashok Kumar, which means the Prince of Happiness, to Gurcharan Das, which means the humble servant of the feet of the Guru. So many years later, I was grown up and I asked the Guru, "Why did you give me that name?" And the Guru said, "Well, son, it's good to be reminded about humility once in a while." And so then he gave me the very best definition of humility there is. And it means, he said, in his words, it is to take your work seriously, but not yourself seriously. And this also went on to become really my mantra for another sort of freedom, the book, the memoir that I have just written. The dedication to that book says, to the happy few who don't take themselves too seriously.
Too seriously. What a lovely start that was. The transition began right at the helm when you were age 4. And talking about transition, Gurcharan ji, you had a diverse career from leading a multinational to becoming a full-time writer and a public intellectual. What have been the most significant turning points in that journey?
Well, I can tell you that it begins in kindergarten. I brought home a report card one day at the end of this is in August, this is in March 1947, the year of our independence. I was 5 years old, and my mother saw me with this report card entering the house, and she says, "Did you stand first?" My father was behind her on the other side, and he said to my mother, "That was the wrong question. Ask him what he likes about school. Does he like to draw? Does he like poetry? Does he like stories? Does he like to sing? Who are his friends?" Those are the right questions, because you have to uncover this young boy's real passion in life. And so we jump on this journey to when I'm 17, and I have the good luck of getting into Harvard University as an undergraduate. And I remember my mother at Palam Airport in Delhi. She has tears in her eyes. And in between the tears, she's saying to me, "Now better study something useful. You have to get a job and you have to make a living. Why don't you become an engineer like your father? You'll always get a job as an engineer." So what this point in time, we have the same binary expressing itself. My mother concerned about making a living. And my father turns to me and he says, "You decide what you want to do. Don't necessarily follow what your mother's advice is." Anyway, I go to Harvard, I sign, and in the form that I want to become do a major in engineering. And I start studying to be an engineer. And I have a roommate who is studying Russian literature. And he's reading the novel Anna Karenina. And one day at lunch, he says, "Gurcharan, if you decide to marry someday, marry somebody like Anna Karenina." And then he starts talking about the beauty of Anna Karenina and talking about all her virtues. And then I say to myself, something is wrong here. Here, this guy is dreaming of sleeping with Anna Karenina. And look at me, I'm calculating pipe friction and mugging up Bernoulli's equation. Something is wrong. And so in the next semester, I switched to the liberal arts and I study philosophy, Greek tragedy, Roman history, history of capitalism. I study literature and I study everything, including Renaissance painting and Bauhaus architecture, and even a course called Sanskrit Love Poetry. And when my mother hears that I am studying Sanskrit at Harvard, she goes, "Hi, hi, mera munda." A dead language, only the dead will give him a job. But my father has to calm her and to tell her that he's making a life. Don't worry, he's making a life through books. Anyway, I graduated in philosophy from Harvard. So this is another milestone in my life where I move again from making a living to making a life. And then I'm back at home in Chandigarh, where my parents live for the summer. I've got a scholarship to do a PhD in philosophy at Oxford. And one day I ask myself, do I really want to spend the rest of my life at that stratosphere of abstract thought? No. I want a life of action. Now, I don't know what that life of action means, but quietly I inform Oxford that I'm not coming. And my mother's worst nightmare has come true, that she has a grown-up son at home, idle, doing nothing, vela, we call it in Punjabi, vela. And so we have a neighbor who comes to visit my mother and have coffee with her in the morning. And she's always, it's a nosy neighbor, needling my mother, asks her, "Hota munda ki kar raha hai? What is your son doing?" And my mother gets embarrassed every day. It's saying, "I don't know, you know." And so I see her embarrassment and I quickly start looking at the newspapers in the morning. I check the Times of India, I check the Tribune, I check Hindustan Times, and finally I find an advertisement, which is a wanted ad for trainees by a company that makes Vicks Vapor Rub. And so I apply and I get the job. And so overnight, I have to move from the ivy covered halls at Harvard doing high philosophy to the dusty bazaars of India, selling Vicks to chemist shops, telling them, "Aaj ek dozen ke saath ek free, 1 dozen, 1 free, kitna mangta hai?" And so life is very different. But I like actually the rough and tumble of the business life, but I miss the intellectual life. And so my father tells me, I can see that I'm uneasy after a couple of years. And so he says, "Well, you've got the weekend. Why don't you do something you like on the weekend? You're working for an American multinational company." And well, so one Sunday morning, I take his advice and I sit down to write a play. I tell myself in my confident, tall 22, age 22, if that Shakespeare too must have sat down on a morning like this to write Hamlet. And so why can't I? Anyway, I begin writing a play. So I have a second weekend career that opens up. The play does well, it wins a prize, it gets produced, it gets published. And then I write a second play, which also was done off Broadway. And anyway, so I've got a second career. I start moving up the company ladder. And then one year, there's a flu in the country. In between, the company had sent me to the States for training, etc. But I'm back in India, and there's a flu. And we sell a lot of Vicks Vapor Rub at that year. And we think we've done a good job to keep the shelves stocked of the chemist shops we run 3 shifts. And as we are celebrating that year, by then, by the way, I moved up in the company and I'm a senior guy. So the day we are celebrating our success that year, I get a summons. The lawyer presents me with a summons from Delhi, and it says that we have broken the law. And what is the law? We have broken the licensing law. By the way, this is the time of the license Raj. We've broken the law, and what have we done? We've sold more Vicks Vapor Rub than allowed in the license. It's 30% more tonnage of Vicks that we have sold during this year. And there's a 3-year jail sentence in breaking that law. And so I'm summoned to Delhi, where the officer in charge, he's the joint secretary in MRTP, and he treats me like a criminal. So I explained to him that there was a flu and I thought we did good. We helped millions of homes, families, children during an epidemic, a pandemic. And so this is the reason why it happened. And he says, "But you broke the law." I said, "Yes, technically we broke the law." He says, "You admit that you broke the law?" And I said, "Yes." And he writes down something. And then he says, "Jao." And I have these 2 lawyers with me who are shivering by now. And so we go out of his office. But at the door, I turn around and I say to him, "Dad, you know, we are American multinational company and the news will get out. It's not every day that an executive of an American multinational goes to jail. And so it will appear all over the world, the New York Times, Washington Post, and everywhere. And so I asked him that what will the world think when they read the story that here was a company that was helping its people during a health emergency and you sent the executive to jail? What will they think of our laws? What will they think of our prime minister? And he said, are you threatening me? I said, no, I'm just telling you this is what will happen. I won't even have to leak the news. It will come out. And he said, Jao. Anyway, when I came out of his office, the lawyers told me, you idiot, you should have fallen on his knees and begged for mercy. And look at you threatening him. And so I had a number of sleepless nights after that. But the government quietly dropped the inquiry. They must have seen common sense. But I was so sickened by this almost nightmare that I was been a socialist like everybody. I joined the Swatantra Party at that point, and I became a classical liberal. And so really, as a country, we only got our economic freedom in 1991. We didn't get it in 1947. And so we lost 2 generations of our country's young people's hopes because there were no other jobs. We created these wonderful IITs and IIMs, but there were no jobs for these. So they all ran away from India because the only jobs were in the government and the IAS or whatever. And so, I'm giving you certain milestones to answer your question as to how finally I became a big supporter of 1991 reforms.
You did. And these are some wonderful pivotal moments that you touched upon. I'll just bring up 2 elements in what you said. You have been a fantastic storyteller so far. One was in that whole journey, Gurcharan, if you look at it, there is this subtle, unburdened confidence in you that you are able to take on anything with a lot of confidence, be it writing, be it on your corporate role. Where do you think this unburdened confidence stemmed from?
Well, I think it begins in the fact that I was my mother said a difficult child, and that I was, my family celebrated when my brother was born because it was very calm. And so from my mother reminds me that my father's boss brought a toy for me when I was a child, and I broke it instantly and then tried to mend it, to fix it, to see how it worked. So there was a streak in me, which made me confident to take a risk to try a different way. Quitting engineering and ending up in philosophy. And then after 91, I really quit the corporate world to become a writer. And it was the same thing. Of course, one thing I must tell you, that wasn't a total risky decision because I had started a second career when that day, following my father's advice about making a life. So for 25 years, I quit at 50, but for 25 years, I had been writing on weekends. So I'd worn 2 hats, Monday to Friday hat and Saturday, Sunday hat. And that I had gained a lot of confidence. I'd written 3 plays, I'd written a novel. All of them had been successful. So I had a certain, not only confidence, but my father's advice about making a life. And it was, every person in his 40s, whether you are successful or less successful, by then I was CEO of Procter and Gamble India. I had been, after 10 years of that, I had gone to the world headquarters. I was managing director, Procter and Gamble worldwide, responsible for strategy, global strategy. And so my wife was horrified when I told her that I wanted to quit, that I was unhappy. Basically, Shrikant, I wasn't happy. I may have reached the top, but I asked myself, is this what life is all about? Selling Vicks and oil of Olay and Pampers and Tide. I mean, all good brands, Gillette Blade, all these are very good brands. But there must be a bigger world outside. And that's what I felt. And so it was my father's advice about making a life. So, I've lived my life with both my mother making a living, my mother's advice, and my father's advice. And I'm not suggesting that you have to quit your job to make a life. No, you can make a life at your job too. And my book, you read it. In the memoir, I told the story of Kamble and how this assistant security guard in a company rose up like a giant in our company and became a role model. And now he loved his job. I think he would have paid us to come to work. And so I would say that the critical thing here in the story is the desire to make a life. I know I was lucky to have a father like that, because I think in every Indian youngster, maybe not so much now when we have a little more prosperity, but when I was growing up, there weren't jobs available. And my mother reflected the insecurities of the Indian middle class. And so I thought there was a bigger world outside. I thought that what would help me make a life now that I had the confidence was, and every Indian asks this question, and I'd studied enough economics at Harvard to know that we were a poor country. And I said, how does a poor country become a rich country? And thus was born the book, India Unbound. And it was the first book that predicted the economic rise of India. And India obliged by rising. And we still are not creating enough jobs, but still we are on a much happier, much stronger path than we were in 91.
I can't wait to get on to your memoir. Before we get in there, you have touched upon a couple of these metaphors pretty consistently. One is making life versus making a living. And the other piece that you have spoken pretty regularly is about, while my friends played golf for the weekend, I kept writing for the weekend. So in the current context, because a lot of our listeners are young listeners, how do you metaphorically have them to kind of relate to these two messages?
Well, I think the idea of making a life versus making a living, a lot of people will sympathize with that idea, because all our parents will always tell us, you've got to make a living, you've got to have a job. Yes, I think, very few of us are so wealthy that we won't need to work and to make a job. But my father's message about making a life meant that, you can make a living, but you must remember that there's something else also, that there is a life, and you owe it to yourself as a human being to question, to live an examined life, and to live a life. So what is that life? What is that life? And the Kamble story in my book will illustrate it. And the first thing is that when you're making a life, you get so absorbed. By the way, in my definition of happiness, there are two sources of happiness. One is to love the work you do, and two is to love the person you live with. And if you achieve these two, you've got it. And I would say that the making a life requires you to get so absorbed in your work. You get so absorbed and you like it so much. One thing happens, you forget the time. You say, oh my God, it's 5 o'clock. I thought it was only 3. So you've lost 2 hours in the afternoon because so time gets distorted. Second, what happens is that you forget yourself, meaning that you don't care. What drives you is your work. And you're not thinking, oh my God, if I do this, will I get the next promotion? Which is a common thought that if you are in the corporate world that you think about, my next promotion. And the other thing about it is, so you don't care actually. When you're so absorbed, you don't care who gets the credit for what you're doing. Krishna, in the Bhagavad Gita, he calls the idea Nishkam Karma. Nishkam Karma is the idea of acting for the sake of the action and not for the fruit, Nishkam Karma, not for the benefit that you will get. Results. Well, results, we all care. If we take an exam, we want to pass. So that's a result. But what we don't care is ultimately that we want, it's the excellence of the work that defines the work. It's the athletes called it being it in the zone. That's the expression they use. And Tendulkar was once asked, just when he was approaching his second double century, he was asked, remember the famous double century at the end of his career?
Yeah.
And it was a brilliant, brilliant job. And so the reporter asked him, how did it feel like when you were approaching that double century? And he said, I don't know. I wasn't even there. By then, the ball had become so big and the bat had become so big that the bat just kept hitting the ball. Now that's self-forgetting. That's the point. The guru, remember, he changed my name. He changed my name. And what did he mean? He said to take your work seriously, but not yourself seriously. It's the same idea. Most of our troubles are we are responsible. We are responsible. What will others think of me? We keep asking ourselves, huh? And we're always worried about approval of others. And that is and it's only when we forget ourselves, the way Tendulkar forgot himself, that we really are, not only we are absorbed, but this is the secret of happiness, to love something you do. And that's, of course, when I changed to writing, it was much more of that. Now, I'm not suggesting after 30 years of being a writer, I mean, I've had my success as a writer too. But the best part of writing is when I forget myself. I write every day for the last 30 years. Wake up at 5:30. I'm at the desk by 6 in this room, in this very, very study. And I don't allow myself in the morning to read email, to do WhatsApp, to even read the newspaper, because all these will put me on someone else's agenda. I don't even do yoga or walking because I may meet other people and they may put me on their agenda. I don't answer phone calls. People think writing is a very creative profession. Oh, you need to get into the mood. Aaj mood nahi hai. Aaj nahi likhenge. Rubbish. It's discipline. And so creative writing or creative work is done with enormous discipline. That's another thing. So anyway, you asked me about making a life. So these are some of the ingredients of making a life.
Wonderful. Continuing with that, we'll talk about another sort of freedom. So by making a life, you did touch upon some elements of how one can get freedom. But now we are talking about another sort of freedom, which is the name of your memoir. And you have touched upon some elements of it during this conversation. And where I want to draw your attention is on some elements that really hit a good chord with me. So I want to pick on some of those elements and want to get your perspective on that. One such thing was, Gurcharan, was this line: most of the shadows in our life are the result of our standing in our own sunshine. How profound.
Well, that's part of the problem, which I talked about, was the ego. That's why I think that to make a life, you have to learn the art of self-forgetting. I'll tell you that it's not an easy thing to do. I mean, the notion, the advice of Krishna to Arjuna in the Bhagavad Gita, it's idealistic. It's idealistic. I mean, it's very hard, because we are hardwired. We have risen through the evolutionary cycle from animals up to apes and so on. So the self has served us to survive. If there was no feeling of self, we may not even survive in the world. But there's a difference between being self-interested and selfish. It's a very thin line. If it's raining, I carry an umbrella. Nothing selfish about that. But very quickly, that self-interest becomes selfish, meaning we're standing in a queue waiting and we are saying, why am I not getting premium treatment? You know, why? It's you want to be always in business class or first class. Why am I in second class? It's self-absorption, and it's not a nice thing. You know such a person. You sit next to this person on the flight, and all he can do is talk about himself, talk about how great he is and all that. Nobody likes that. It's much better to have the confidence. It's much better to have the confidence to know your worth. You talked about confidence to change your life from one. Why did I, from an engineer, become a philosopher? And from a philosopher, the salesman of Vicks, and then became a CEO. And then I quit to become a writer. So all these things require not so much to tell yourself how great I am, but to be humble and seek for an experience that makes you live an examined life. And that's what the guru also was giving advice. So that's the one way I would answer. And frankly, once you do that, then you achieve what I call a secular form of moksha. In other words, this is the fourth in a quartet of books that I've written. And we have this notion in the Hindu tradition, Artha, Dharma, Kama, Moksha. These are the four, what's called the Purusharthas, the four goals of life, the four aims of life. So I wrote the first book. I mean, I wasn't aware that I was following this, but I wrote India Unbound, which was about Artha, about living the material side of life, material well-being. Then I wrote The Difficulty of Being Good, which was about Dharma, which was the moral side of life, the moral dimension, the ethical dimension of life. Then I wrote a book on Kama, the riddle of desire. That was on the third goal of life, which was I celebrated desire, which is another very human goal. And so another sort of freedom is about the fourth goal of life, moksha. Now, our understanding of moksha today is different from the original meaning of moksha. Original meaning meant just moksha, meaning freedom, which means that in the Sanskrit, ancient Sanskrit literature, they talk about when a prisoner comes out of jail, you say, mukti ho gayi, he got freedom. When you pay a debt to somebody, you feel mukti ho gayi, moksha. So it is a purely secular idea. It's only really later in our history, and particularly after Shankara, that moksha became this very spiritual ideal of going beyond birth and rebirth, and it acquired this supernatural meaning, which was beyond this life. So my meaning of freedom in another sort of freedom is precisely self-forgetting, diminishing your ego. The Vedanta and all talks about eradicating your ego. No, I don't think you can eradicate the ego. That's not human, but you can diminish it. And that's what I am talking about.
Yeah. And you also have a very strong point of view on an autobiography versus memoir. And you do make a recommendation for people to write their own memoirs. Can you touch upon that element as well?
Well, I think we all want to know ourselves. And what I have discovered, Shrikant, is that a memoir, let me first define the difference between an autobiography and a memoir. An autobiography Yes, it's a straight retelling of your life. I was born here. My father was this, and I went to school here, and so on. And I worked here and everything, right? A memoir tries to connect the dots in your life and tries to find a pattern. In both cases, whether it's an autobiography or memoir, you have to remember. You depend on memory. But in the case of a memoir, you go beyond retelling your story. You actually try and find a pattern in your life by connecting the different incidents that happened to you. And so, if you're lucky, as I was, it results in getting to know yourself better. My pattern was this struggle in my life, constant struggle to give purpose and meaning to my life. And that's why I kept doing these crazy things at different points in my life, you know. So my advice to everybody, including your listeners of this podcast, Srikant, is to write a memoir. Why? Because you have to relive your life. And I've discovered that reliving your life is better than living it. Why is it better? Because you can play God. You choose to remember what you remember, and you choose to write about what you write. And so you're in charge. And so in that process, you develop, you evolve a certain knowledge of yourself.
Now, what practices do you adapt to keep yourself so sharp, so witty, Gurucharanji?
Well, now, I mean, I was born in 1942, in the middle of the World War, when all these guys were bashing each other, Hitler and Stalin and Mao. No, Mao wasn't there, but Hitler, Stalin, Churchill, and Emperor Hirohito. And luckily, India escaped those world wars. No, I am now in my 80s, but I think what kept me going is one, I narrated to you my routine. So if you were going to wake up at 5:30 every day, you better sleep by 10 o'clock at night, and which is what I do.
And swim at 4 in the afternoon as well.
And the other thing, so when I finish at 12, my writing, then I go for a swim. And luckily, even in Delhi, in the winter, it's very cold, but there's a pool nearby with warm water. And so solar heated, warm water. And so I swim, and that opens the pores of the skin, the body, and relaxes the body. Then I come and have lunch with my wife. And it's then that I actually lie down. And that's when I read the paper, whether on my iPad or in the hard copy of the newspaper. And only after 1 hour do I meet my secretary and do the affairs of the day. Everybody has to. I'm on boards, there's the bank work, investments, all those things. And then at 5 is my social time. And social time means I go for a walk, and usually with somebody who wants to meet me or I want to meet. And so we walk and we talk. And so between swimming and walking, I get my daily exercise. And so that's the kind of life routine I live. And also, writing keeps me on my toes, whether it's a newspaper column or it's another book, but it keeps the mind active. For 30 years, I've not asked in the morning. I've not asked, and what shall I do today? There's always something that needs to be done. And I'm pulled like a magnet from my bedroom to my study.
Yes, study is so reflective of that. So we'll round off our conversation on conformity is a prison. we should not be defined by what we do, but what we are. And you wrote this in response to your visiting MD's wife and her wanting to know about Indian culture and how you were prepared to kind of give her the brief of India. And then it turned out to be something else. Her expectation was to know about culture, not about business.
Right. Well, that's the other, we have talked about this idea this afternoon. And I would only say that when you free yourself, that other sort of freedom I talked about is partly to free yourself from what do others think of me. If you're working and you're working without any expectations, society's expectations, your parents' expectations, you achieve a degree of freedom. And I would say that that's what makes you who you are. That's living to be who you are instead of, what you asked me. So I think that's the freedom. It's another way of, not to suggest that I've achieved it, by the way. It's a work in progress. I can forget myself when I'm writing, but when the writing is over and I go to the bookshop that in Khan Market, I check the store, and when I find, it happened a few months ago, I went to Bari and Sons and I found that here I'd written a new book, but it wasn't in the window. So I charged in and I said, Yaar, kya ho gaya? I'm a famous writer and you don't have my book in the window. So you see, the ego never goes away. It's very, very difficult. The thing is to recognize that's not the part of you that is ultimately fulfilling. The part of you it's fulfilling is the work you do. And I'm still bothered whether I have achieved what I set out to be. And there's that quote of Seneca's that I used in my book I mentioned, who Seneca, says, while I was busy, life passed me by. And sometimes I also ask myself that, am I too busy? And has life passed me by? And then I ask, what is that life? And then I wonder what my father meant, making a life. And then if Seneca could ask this question, now I must tell your listeners, Seneca was a Roman, very successful Roman writer, playwright, the leading intellectual of the Roman Empire. He was advisor to the emperor, and the emperor was incompetent. So that means Seneca was running the empire. And then he fell in love with the wife of the emperor, and he had to flee for his wife's life because they were going to kill him. Now, for him to ask this question, if he did not live his life, who did? Oh, it's not an easy question to answer.
Indeed. So, Gurcharanji, we have been having wonderful conversation, particularly around your memoir, as we are getting closer to home run. And for somebody who has followed India's economic growth very closely, what have you observed of India's journey over the decades? And what do you think is the future of this country over the next 20 years?
Well, let's begin in 1991. That's when our economy really began. The first 40 years were a washout. So since 1991, we have grown at 6% a year average over 30 odd years, exclude the COVID years. And now that's, as I said, very good. We have lifted 450 million people out of poverty. The middle class has grown from 10% to 30%, but we still have not created enough jobs. And why? Because we have failed to create an industrial revolution. Our economy is fired only on 2 cylinders, not on 3. What has failed is manufacturing. And services have done very well. And they will continue to do very well. And thank God, we are known in the world because of IT and the digital revolution. In agriculture, we were a deficit country, a basket case in the 1960s, I remember. And today we are the fourth largest exporter of agricultural products. But manufacturing has failed. Manufacturing, and you can tell from these three statistics, it's less than 15% of GDP. It employs less than 12% of employees, and its exports 2% of global exports. Now, every country that went from being poor to middle class fired through manufacturing by creating industrial revolution. In the last 50 years, the Asian tigers came up. Japan, Korea, Taiwan, and latest China. They all rose up on the back of export of labor-intensive manufacture. That's where we have failed. And so if we want to achieve the objective that Mr. Modi has set for India at 2047, we will have to create an industrial revolution. We can't do without it. We can't skip the manufacturing stage. And it's still not too late. Mm-hmm. And also, we can still reap the demographic dividend. We have 20 years before we begin to age as a country. China's already begun to age. And also, this is a good moment in history because investors are scared of China because of China's own flaws. But we have to do the heavy lifting. And heavy lifting means we'll have to do the reforms that will make our economy competitive. Labor reforms, land reforms, agricultural reforms, all these that Mr. Modi failed to do in the last 10 years. He promised in 2014, Vikas, Parivartan. We haven't achieved that yet. And so I would say the one model I have found that we can follow, a success story, a recent success story, which can become the trigger for growth. And we are in a much better position today to achieve that industrial revolution because infrastructure is much better. The road mileage has doubled since 2011. Port handling capacity has quadrupled. So one of the good things this government has done is infrastructure. We are now one country thanks to GST. We have an insolvency code, so we are not stuck with these underperforming companies. So a lot of good, but the model that I would suggest is the model by which Apple iPhones, have begun manufacturing in India in a very short time. All the phones in the world, iPhones, are made in China. But very quickly, 14% of iPhones are being made in India. And what this has meant? It has meant direct employment through 3 factories of 150,000 people. 70% of these are women, and they are not high-skilled people. For many, it's their first-time job. Just training on the job from 4 to 6 weeks made them perfectly capable. So one thing we have to realize that electronics is a labor-intensive sector, electronics assembly. And now, if we can bring the component makers of iPhone, because now it's only assembly of iPhone, but the real job and the real value added is the components. Unfortunately, they're all Chinese. But I think the government has now realized that it does not have to compromise security and bring these guys, because that's how technology transfer will take place when Indians start working for these Chinese component manufacturers. And also the job multiplier is much greater then, because you have a small company who sells to the component company, the ancillary to iPhone. And then there's a micro industry that sells to that company. So that's how the chain of multiplication takes place and job creation takes place. So instead of trying to wait for Indian champions to develop, which will take time. There's not a single global brand today which is Indian. And so we should target all the global leaders in manufacturing, in the labor-intensive areas, garments, shoes, toys, food processing, electronics. A lot of electronics are labor-intensive. If I were Mr. Modi, that's what I would tell. That from tomorrow, that's the job. And he can make those reforms happen. Only now it will be tougher because he has coalition partners, a very aggressive opposition. He'll have to learn to sell the ideas. And a reformer has to sell the ideas. You can't just impose them. Margaret Thatcher, who was a great reformer, used to say, I spend 20% of my time reforming and 80% selling the reforms.
So there you go. The mantra for economically developed India is focus on manufacturing.
And jobs. And they will bring the jobs. And India, 60% of India has to become middle class from 30% today. But it can be done.
Not a far outcry. I think there is hope, there is ambition, and there is aspiration in this country. Gurcharan, this has been lovely conversation. Wish the time was frozen and we could have continued for some more time. This show is all about creating ripples of inspiration. Before we sign off, what would be your Inspire Someone Today message to all of our listeners?
Well, I would say achieve another sort of freedom. I would say live lightly. Live lightly. Patanjali also uses this expression. It's called Laghima. In the Yoga Sutras, Patanjali refers to Laghima as one of the siddhis, one of the perfections. And the practice of yoga gives you that lightness also. But also self-forgetting gives you a sense of that freedom and lightness. So live lightly, not like a feather, but like a bird.
Live lightly so that it is good enough for you to propel forward, propel higher, and achieve whatever you want to achieve. On that note, Gurcharan, thank you so much for sharing another sort of freedom with me and all of my listeners. Thank you for joining us on this episode of Inspire Someone Today. This is Srikanth, your host, signing off. Until next time, continue to carry the ripples of inspiration. Stay inspired, keep spreading the light.